Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one. One where we dive into tons of middle grade novels and stories, and another where we just dive into tons of interesting topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn about fantasy sports. Yes, you play the game, you watch the game, and guess what people do? They make up their own teams with their own players and they compete against other people. I'm sure you've heard about it. If you're a member of my audience that's not into sports, stay tuned because what you're about to hear is not only interesting and fascinating, but it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And when I say that, I'm talking upwards of $40 billion. And not long ago, it just started with a bunch of guys with paper and pencil. It's a fascinating story. And let's start off with the name. Fantasy sports, fantasy football, fantasy baseball. Well, obviously, without knowing anything, you can imagine why they called it that, because the teams are not real. They're made up. They're real players, but you pick your teams. And actually, two University of Washington students in the mid-'80s are generally speaking credited with attaching the name fantasy football, fantasy sports to the name because they issued the first nationally distributed magazine that was called the Fantasy Football Index. It was originally a project that they had put out there, but just in bold print, the fact that this name, Fantasy Football Index, was now on grocery store magazine racks across the country, it stuck. So let's first talk about the basics, what it is, and then we'll get into its history. So I mentioned imaginary teams, and you compete against your friends or any league that you set up. It can be automatically set up for you today through platforms like ESPN or Yahoo that go in, you have a draft, you pick your players. Again, it could be any sport, and then you have your roster. In fantasy football, for example, the most popular platform where the most number of people play, and I will say this up front, no doubt it's the most popular because it's the easiest. You really only have to set your lineup in terms of who's playing once a week, because obviously the teams play once a week. Well, each player will earn points based on certain categories. So, for example, a quarterback could earn points for passing yards, how many touchdowns they made. A running back could earn points for how many rushing yards they had, how many receptions, how many touchdowns. And that's the premise. Now, each league is set up differently based on how you want to go about it. You can have it be based on points, like I mentioned, for each different category of a statistic that a player accumulates. But here's the important point to know up front. Every specific league can be set up however you like, but generally speaking, it's either a season-long competition between, again, groups of friends, and typically small groups. It could be 10 to 12, but certainly it can be larger groups. How do you determine the winners? Well, it's season-long competition or it's week-to-week competition. And you're either going up against the rest of your group, or typically the most popular option is where you're playing a specific team or another specific person for that 1 week, and then you either determine the winner at the end of the season, either by winning each week, you would get one win or one loss, or depending upon how many categories you could have. In football, let's say you could have categories for passing yards. You could have rushing yards. And usually maybe there's 10 categories, and each of those categories, if you win each week, you would get a win. So it could be cumulative points for each category. If I've confused you already, just know that it's fun and it's certainly a great, if you're a sports fan and you haven't gotten into this yet, it's a great way to follow the sport, keep up on new players, and just have a way to stay in touch almost every day with friends, old friends, people that typically you won't have communications with on an everyday basis because you're busy, you have a family, whatever it is. Hey, I'm together with a bunch of groups, friends of mine I grew up with, a group where people from work, in the best leagues. I'm involved in football, baseball, basketball. A shout out to my neighbor, his son roped me in. I'm now involved on a daily basis with a text thread with guys and gals that are 30 years younger than me, and all we're doing is talking about the games, keeping in touch with each other, but mostly just making fun of each other. So a shout out to Torn ACLs, Fantasy Football, Tom, Maz, Amy, Durf, and baseball, basketball, like I said, as well. And just this past week, Beto destroyed me. He destroyed me 10-0. 10 categories that we compete on a weekly basis, and I didn't win any of them. But this is the fun, this is the suffering, and isn't this sport? As Pat Riley so famously said so many years ago, there's winning and there's suffering. But having said that, the Torn ACL Fantasy Football League, only been around 4 years, and guess who's won 2 of those 4 years? Yes, yours truly. And one other point about the leagues and how they're structured, there's also daily fantasy sports. It's commonly called DFS, but that's more of a solitary endeavor. But yes, you can create teams, you can create lineups, you can get in and just bet on certain players, certain categories. And yes, this is where the blur becomes with betting, online sports betting, and fantasy sports. They've almost kind of coalesced together. As a matter of fact, the groundwork and the infrastructure that daily fantasy sports had, well, that was able to segue right into the modern mobile sports books. And yes, here is what happened with what you know today as FanDuel, DraftKings. You've heard it, you've seen the advertisements on TV. Well, for years, obviously, you could only bet in Las Vegas, and it had to be in person. The pathway to widespread legal sports betting outside of Vegas actually began under the guise of the fact that this was a game of skill. It wasn't just random betting. And this was called the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act of 2006. It carved out an exception for fantasy sports. It was a loophole that gave rise to DFS that I just referenced before. So now you had giants, the FanDuel that was incorporated and started in 2009, and then DraftKings started in 2012. The huge shift, believe it or not, started here in New Jersey with Chris Christie. You see, there was a law on the books. It was called PASPA, Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. It was in 1992, and it banned individual game sports betting outside of Nevada. Well, starting in 2011, Chris Christie started a 6-year battle to get the federal government to allow this individual sports betting around the country. And again, why am I talking about this? Because fantasy sports ended up becoming part of the ability to bet not only individually on games, but through these leagues. Well, his state law in 2012 basically allowed and legalized sports gambling in the Atlantic City, New Jersey casinos and throughout the state at the state racetracks. And it basically said it challenged the federal government and all the sports leagues to, come on, just stop us. It was intentional. It was trying to get this new industry, this ability to bet on sports games legal. Initially, it was propping up and helping Atlantic City. They didn't like that Las Vegas and Nevada had pretty much a monopoly on sports betting, because the other problem was it was underground for too many years. And when I say underground, it wasn't legal, but yet people were betting on sports all the time. Well, right away, all the sports leagues sued. It became, like I said, this long legal battle, and through some strategic and really smart decisions as to how to make this a reality, the Supreme Court in 2018 basically said that the federal ban was unconstitutional under the 10th Amendment, and immediately returned the power to all the individual states to legalize, regulate, and launch all of their individual sports betting markets. And that's when FanDuel and DraftKings basically took off, and you knew it. You could see it right away. This is what now is the reality with sports betting. On your phone, you can bet on pretty much anything related to any sport. And yes, fantasy sports piggybacked and went along with the ride and certainly benefited. So when did all this start? And who invented fantasy sports? And what was the first sport that really got going? Well, believe it or not, it was baseball, but really it was football. When I say baseball, if you're my age, you grew up, you were totally into baseball, guess what? You were playing Stratomatic. And there was an early form of another kind of game. It was a tabletop game with dice and cards, and that was called ABA baseball. But guess what? This wasn't the true fantasy sports that we know today, where you're creating your teams and you're drafting your players. It was just games. ABA baseball, it was a tabletop baseball game, and it was sold by this guy by the name of J. Richard Seitz in 1951. It used cards, dice, and statistics to recreate baseball games. And then I mentioned Stratomatic. Yeah, that was created by Hal Richmond, and it was first released in 1961. But like I said, it was just coming up and playing your own games with the board and dice. It wasn't taking the actual results from actual games and then using that to compete. That's the essence of fantasy sports today. And the person that's credited with really creating this modern fantasy approach began with football. It started with Bill Winkenbach. He was a businessman. He was part owner of the Oakland Raiders. In 1962, when the Raiders were traveling, Winkenbach began developing this little fun football competition with Bill Tunnell, who worked in the Raiders public relations department, and Scotty Sterling. He was a sports writer for the Oakland Tribune. Another important friend early on that played this game together was an Oakland Tribune sports editor, and his name was George Ross. They developed a system in which people and guys would draft real professional football players and receive points based on what those players did during the NFL and back then, yes, the AFL games. Sounds familiar, right? The league became known as the Greater Oakland Professional Pigskin Prognosticators League. Hey, are you kidding me? And they basically called it GOPPL. Yes, GOPPPL. They held their first draft at Winkenbach's Oakland home in August of 1963. And the original league was obviously just exclusive with only certain members playing, and they had connections to the Raiders. And when I say connections to the Raiders, it was just members and friends associated with the team, whether it was actually on the team or following the team. The early version required clearly lots of work. No websites. Yes, there were statistics, but it was bare bones statistics, and you needed to take the statistics and convert them into points. So it was a labor of love, no doubt, but it was work. The next big figure was one of the members of the Goppel League. His name was Andy Musolimas. In 1969, he introduced the game to customers at this sports bar, King X Sports Bar in Oakland. Instead of obviously specific people in their little small league, he opened up the leagues to members of the general area, right? Anybody that was frequenting this particular bar. It spread from bars to workplaces to other people, and no doubt at this point it was on its way. As a matter of fact, Musolimas, he had actually, by 1980, was actually operating an all-women's fantasy football division. I remember distinctly getting involved with fantasy sports, and now again, we're still talking about statistics being available, a lot more details, but it was all from magazines, and it was all, again, done manually in terms of somebody crunching all the numbers. There were programs that started coming out. I distinctly remember Dave Goodman, a good friend, Mitch Letterstein. We would leave from our house in New Rochelle, New York, and go all the way out to Mitch's friends. He was living in Westport, Connecticut at the time, and it was a lot of fun. 15 guys getting together. We would literally do the draft all together. And listen, I had created, when I was a little kid, I have still to this day statistics and stats printed out. I would play wiffle ball, yes, by myself. I would hit the ball, and if it went over into the Gurmiller's yard, it would be a home run, and I would track all these players and who was leading the league in all these different categories. Hey, this is the genesis and where this industry started, with every kid out in their yard playing baseball, playing basketball, playing football, and just dreaming of, yes, being a professional player. But the person really that is credited with bringing this burgeoning fun game to the masses is Daniel Okrent. He started Rotisserie Baseball. And if you're deep into the weeds of fantasy sports, you know about rotisserie. And listen to this. He started with friends in 1980 this player auction and game that became known as Rotisserie League Baseball. And yes, where did the name come from? Rotisserie, right? Rotisserie chicken? What is this? Well, it was a restaurant, and this is where Daniel and his friends first got together and started the draft. It was at this restaurant, Rotisserie Francaise, and I'm sure that I don't have the pronunciation right, but it was a restaurant in the 70s and 80s. It was at 155 East 52nd Street in Midtown Manhattan, and this is where they had their drafts, so he named it Rotisserie Baseball. And what made his game different was especially during the draft, and this still continues today, where each owner has an imaginary budget and they bid on certain players. So it's not just you picking first and you want to pick Shohei Ohtani. With having a budget of $100, you had to choose how much money you were going to spend on a certain player. And it became so much more of not just chance and simple kind of odds. It really took a lot of strategy. So the original rotisserie system usually was 8 categories, and a lot of this still continues today. So for hitters, you had batting average, home runs, run batted in, and stolen bases. Pitchers, typically it was victories, saved, earned run average. And what no doubt really reached it to the masses was, believe it or not, the 1981 baseball strike. there was nothing for sports writers to write about. So they got out and in the press started writing about these leagues that they had created. Rotisserie now is simply known as Roto. As the internet became a reality, there was a company called Grandstand Sports Services, and through America Online began really capitalizing and making money off of this burgeoning business. And it helped with statistics and putting drafts together, everything. So now it really started to go online, and certainly league commissioners that ran the individual leagues had a place to make it simpler for everyone. The earliest pioneers were no doubt, there were two that really aren't around today. It was Commissioner.com. It was also Sportsline. But yes, right from the beginning, it was ESPN and Yahoo that are still around today. CBS actually acquired Commissioner.com, and that's how CBS became involved. And yes, they are a big player as well. If you're looking at where am I going to go to set up my leagues? And another big company was Roto World. That was founded in the late 1990s. And what this company meant to the industry was it just bombarded us with so much information, so many statistics on a daily basis that you can follow a player. Now, in terms of popularity, I referenced this before, but in this order, it's football, baseball, basketball, hockey, and throughout the world, yes, fantasy soccer, and believe it or not, the most popular fantasy platform in terms of the number of users is cricket. Why? Because it's obviously so huge in India, but the other sports that are out there, you've got fantasy rugby, lacrosse, cycling, horse racing, esports, wrestling, surfing, and even professional fishing. Are you kidding me? I talked about how big of an industry it is, and you can see why. The reports I've read out there suggest that there's 85 million different people that are playing fantasy sports, and India alone has reported more than 250 million users by late 2025. Now, a few final points before we wrap up the podcast here. I neglected to mention the type of leagues. Generally speaking, you're talking about three different types. The biggest and most popular are what they call redraft leagues. In other words, you have your team that you draft just for that season, and then your team is gone. The other type is what they call keeper leagues, which you can imagine is, yes, this team that you draft originally is your team. It almost corresponds with a regular baseball team, a regular football team. You have your core amount of players, and yes, you can draft new players and you can trade players, but ultimately it's called a keeper league. And the final one is dynasty, where, you know what? The team you draft is the team you have the majority of players you keep, and that's what it is. You can only add players on a limited basis from year to year. Now, all along, I've mentioned money. Yes, depending upon the league and how you set it up with your friends, there could be a lot of money involved or very little involved. And you know what? No money involved at all. It's just a matter of each particular league choosing what they want to do. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's supposed to be fun. It is fun, but too often I've heard it. Thankfully, I haven't experienced it myself, but leagues can get out of hand. Friendships can be lost. And, fighting over silly things. Thankfully, I haven't experienced that at all myself, but I do know, and you should know, that it's out there in our society today that typically, whether it's losing week to week, but the big thing is if you lose, if you come in last place in your league, you are punished. You are embarrassed in some way, shape, or form. Let's just say that I know that a friend had to dress up as Pikachu and walk through downtown Seattle, and that was their punishment, and it had to be filmed. And boy, oh boy, was this fantastic. It was funny, and he really did a wonderful job. So a shout out to Luke and everyone for taking this journey with me, learning all about fantasy sports. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We are on Facebook. We are on X. We are on YouTube. We are on Spotify. Hit that plus button in Apple Podcasts in the top right-hand corner to subscribe to the podcast. Any podcast platform of your choosing. Follow, subscribe. Love the ratings and reviews. And very soon, I'm going to offer a way to support the podcast. I'm having a blast, and I do really appreciate all of you listening. So until next time, have fun and keep learning.